On Gardening by Robert F. Murray. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. If I have any claim at all to speak on this subject, it is derived less from experience than from observation. What little practical knowledge of gardening I possess was acquired in early youth, under compulsion; and even then it was restricted to the weeding of paths and the watering of plants. Neither of these operations, useful as they both undoubtedly are, can be said to foster a taste for the art or an acquaintance with the science of gardening. They are mechanical and unattractive. Anybody can do them, and nobody would do them if he could help it. This is especially true of weeding. To be set to weed a number of grass-grown gravel paths on a Saturday afternoon in July has been the unhappy fate of many a schoolboy from time immemorial; and I believe there are few instances on record in which the schoolboy has not either openly or secretly rebelled. Many causes urge him to do so. The sun dries up the marrow in his bones, the wind is so still as to induce the belief that it will never blow again, his back aches, his knees are cramped, his eyes are dazzled by the yellow glare of the gravel. Nor is this all. The minute green pests are so wonderfully productive that they seem to increase and multiply before his eyes; and, paradox as it may appear, the more he pulls up, the more there are left. He is quick to notice this discouraging circumstance, and the discovery too often leads him to the adoption of certain devices, not over honest. For instance, he will gather from the surface of the path quantities of loose gravel, which he will dispose in so judicious a manner as to conceal many growing weeds from the stern eye of the inspecting parent. Or he will content himself with nipping off the heads of the weeds, while he leaves their roots intact in the ground, there to bring forth and bud anew before many days. By such unsatisfactory methods he strives after economy of labour; and indeed he does accomplish one weeding with almost startling celerity; but then, how short is the period that intervenes before he must undertake another! It will be seen that weeding is the parent of sin as well as of sorrow; and it is therefore, except on the score of absolute necessity, entirely to be deprecated. The watering of plants is an innocent recreation compared to it. Generally speaking, plants are watered in the cool of the morning or evening, and the operator is not compelled to suffer intolerable heat in addition to performing distasteful toil. Even watering, however, has many drawbacks. Carrying a heavy can to and fro, and holding it a long time suspended over the beds, is apt to tire the arm. Then the watering can may leak. As a rule it does. Before long the young Aquarius finds one leg of his trousers growing soppy, and one foot getting clammy and cold. Ought we to be surprised if in proportion as his temperature falls his temper rises? Besides, he would much rather be playing marbles. I have been betrayed into too long a digression upon the sorrows of the youthful apprentice to gardening. Amateur he cannot with propriety be called, for it is years before he can even look at a garden without a pang of remembered pain. Such, at least, was the case with me. I vowed that if I ever came to own a plot of ground I would turn it into a shrubbery and let it run wild. Nature, I argued, is better than art; and at all events an art achieved at the expense of so much misery is not worth practising. But from the time when I outgrew this morbid feeling I have always admired and envied all gardeners, from Adam downward. And more especially Adam, for there were no weeds in the Garden of Eden. Yet, even since the fall, the gardener himself has been free from the ignoble toil of weeding, which is always left to boys, and is, perhaps, a judgment upon them for their original sin. The gardener is busied in grander operations. He delves, he hoes, he plants, he sows, and, above all, he plans. His is no mere handicraft. He works with his hands, it is true, but he is also for ever working with his head. Arrangement and order do not cease to shape themselves within his busy brain. If you told him so, the chances are 10 to 1 that he would scratch his head and deny it, not knowing what you meant. It is true nevertheless, and members of the craft have not been wanting who were fully alive to its truth and importance. There still flourishes somewhere in the west of England an old man with curved legs and sandy whiskers, who is accustomed to work by the day in the gardens of those who can afford to hire him. Sometimes he will be employed by the week together in one garden. On one such occasion his temporary master observed that Joe never came to his work until the morning was well advanced. So on the third or fourth day he waited in the garden, and by Joe came sauntering leisurely in. "Good morning, Joe." "Marnin', zur." "Nice marnin', smarnin'." "It seems to me you always come rather late to work, Joe." "Ees, zur," was the ready answer. "But I'd a lie in bed and planny for 'ee." In this way he considered that he was fulfilling his engagement, and so, perhaps, he was. Yet it must be admitted that it requires faith, more than a grain of mustard seed, to enable one to pay cheerfully for such invisible service, the invisible service of a hireling being always more or less doubtful. But with your true gardener, who is not paid by the day, but whose labour pays him after many days, there can be no question of the planning. He is a skilled general, and disposes his forces in the best methods at his command methods gathered from the traditions of his predecessors, the experience of himself and his contemporaries, and his own anxious thought. He has nothing to gain by pretending to plan; he has everything to lose by not planning. Nor is his interest in his work of a merely utilitarian kind. He is in a certain sense an artist, and like other artists he takes pride and pleasure in his work for its own sake. He has the same delight in good workmanship, the same or a similar love of broad conception. Like the painter, he plans with his brain and executes with his hand. His work, like the painter's, is his own, bringing him pleasure as well as profit. He looks round his garden and says to himself, "All this is mine; the labour is mine, and the fruit of it is mine." With what honest self gratulation he gazes on the trimly pruned trees, on the well ordered beds. How great is his satisfaction in a fine potato crop, or a splendid yield of parsnips! He is bound to acknowledge that sun and rain have done their part in producing the good results, but then, on the other hand, sun and rain have done just as much for Williams's garden, and his potatoes are not worth the trouble of digging. Of course, it is not to be supposed that a gardener's lot is one of uninterrupted pleasure or undisturbed peace. Lord Tennyson has told us that "the very source and fount of day is dashed with wandering isles of night," and so even a gardener's life has its annoyances and difficulties. His crops will occasionally fail, in spite of wise planning and careful labour. The slugs will eat his strawberries, the greenfly will make havoc among his rose trees, the wireworm and the frost are his sworn foes. He has many things against him. But then, what a glorious constitution he has with which to withstand and overcome them! He has no dyspepsia to darken his spirit or enfeeble his will. All day he breathes pure air and smells fresh, healthy scents. All night he sleeps the sleep of the just, unbroken by evil dreams. He is early to bed and early to rise, and he is consequently healthy, wealthy, and wise. His troubles are not engendered within, but come to him from without. There are no traitors in his camp to fear, but only open foes in the field to face and fight. Strong in himself, he need not fear what they can do to him. It is an ideal life, the gardener's, and a noble profession. You cannot call it a trade. The trading element only comes in when he parts with his produce to the greengrocer, who keeps a fusty little shop in a back street. The gardener is no more a tradesman than the artist. The one sells his pictures to a dealer, who makes his living by selling them again at a higher price. The other does the same with his potatoes. The picture dealer and the greengrocer are tradesmen, but the gardener and the artist are professional men. Thus far I have looked at gardening only in the light of a profession. But for the amateur there is no finer hobby. Antiquarian research is not to be compared with it, scientific dabbling is barren beside it, and, if politics be laid in the balance, they are altogether lighter than vanity. Who has not known and envied the country clergyman with a passion for gardening? It is such a peaceful passion, not a fierce and intermittent flame, but a steady glow, imparting light and warmth to life. The clergyman's pleasure in his garden is, of course, unalloyed by the pecuniary cares which must beset the professional gardener; while his pride in it is infinitely greater than the other's can possibly be. Is he not pursuing the art for the pure love of it, without hope or desire of gain? He can sit down to dinner with his guest, and when the latter praises the cauliflower, or avers that he never tasted finer green peas in his life, he can beam with satisfaction and say, "I grew them." He can tell little anecdotes concerning the potatoes on the table; he is the biographer of the carrots. And when, after dinner, on a fine evening in early autumn, he takes his guest out and shows him over the garden, he has no lack of topics for conversation. He could talk for a week. If the guest should happen also to be a country clergyman and amateur gardener, the dialogue is something wonderful to hear. They grow more excited over the merits of a favourite plum tree than two cabinet ministers over a dissolution. The host exhausts his powers of eloquence in dilating upon the colour, size, and flavour of his plums. The guest is equally fervid in eulogizing a tree of his own at home. "These are very fine," he says, condescendingly, "but come over to my place if you want to taste plums." And so the two honest old souls go on, each praising the other's produce, but maintaining the superiority of his own. As iron sharpeneth iron, so doth a man's fruit make sweeter that of his friend. In addition to these dialogical delights, the clergyman can take prizes at the local horticultural shows, and so gratify the feeling of ambition that lurks in the breast of every man, even of the country clergyman. Best of all, his rooms are lighted up and sweetened with flowers, whose sweetness and light are doubled by the knowledge that they are to a certain extent his own creations; perhaps even more so than his sermons are. He is a blessing to others and to himself. There is not a wedding or a festival, a mourning or a funeral, for which his flowers are not in request. The festival he enriches with glowing colour, the mourning he beautifies with pure and saintly white. For himself, he gathers joy and health and heart's ease in his garden. By his labour there he lengthens his life and makes it more worth living. And when at length his hand forgets to pluck the flowers that have carried hope and inspiration into many a weary sick room, their place is taken in grateful hearts by flowers of remembrance, surely not less fragrant. End of On Gardening, by Robert F. Murray.